Okay. Now, by way of introduction, we're here now on Daf Lamed and Gimel and Beis studying Ula, who said in the name of Reish Lakish that Bia b'miktsas shmei Bia, that when the Torah prohibits a Tameh from entering into the Azara, even if part of his body, even if only his hands go in, that is a Chiyuv Kares. The Gemara had raised an objection to Ula based on the Brisa. And now we're going to have Ravina with a whole new interpretation of that Brisa, and that will defend Ula. Ravina Amar le'inyan Malkus Itmar. You know what Reish Lakish was talking about, meaning Ula in the name of Reish Lakish? He was talking about not Kares, but Malkus. And if a Tameh enters into the Azara B'tuma, his whole body, then, according to Reish Lakish, he will get Malkus for Bias Migdash. But it has nothing to do with Miktas Bia. We're not talking about a case where he puts his hands into the Azara. According to Reish Lakish, he gets Malkus when his entire body enters into the Migdash, which again will explain why, according to Reish Lakish, the Mitzora, who's still Tameh, has to remain in the Shara Nikanor. He can't go into the Azara. Otherwise, he's Chayiv Malkus. However, Ravin likewise came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he had a different tradition than Ravina in what Reish Lakish was saying. Kiyasa Ravin Amar Abba, Abo, Le'inyan Tami Shenoga B'Kodesh Itmar. So this is going to introduce a whole new sugya that's going to occupy our minds for the rest of today's daf, and that is Tamei Shenoga B'Kodesh. Now, let's differentiate here, because this is the background to the sugya, between Truma and Hegdesh. As a general rule, Hegdesh is more chamor, more strict and severe than Truma. And that expresses itself in the fact that with regard to Hegdesh, we have what's called Me'ila. With regard to Truma, there's no Me'ila. And there are many other differences between Hegdesh and Truma. But on the whole, barring the exception of this sugya that we're going to learn about Tomei Shenoga Behegdesh, we're going to find that any chumrah that applies to Truma will certainly, with a Kal V'chomer, apply to Hegdesh. And the exception is going to be Rabbi Yochanan, as we'll soon see, with regard to Negia of a Tameh. And Rabbi Yochanan is going to derive the conclusion that the Torah prohibits Negia of a Tameh only in the case of Truma. And paradoxically, according to Rabbi Yochanan, despite the fact that a Tameh who touches Truma will get Malchus for that, we're going to derive that from Psukim, nevertheless, if a Tameh comes in contact with Hegdesh, no matter what level of Hegdesh it is, he doesn't get Malchus. And Reish Lakish rejects it. So Tameh Shenoga Behegdesh, Bekodesh, according to Reish Lakish, and Ravin is quoting Reish Lakish, is Chayv Malchus. He violates a law. Diidmar, Tameh Shenoga Bekodesh, Reish Lakish Amar Loka, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eino Loka. So that's the paradox of Rabbi Yochanan, that although Rabbi Yochanan concedes that Tameh Shenoga B'Truma gets Malchus, but Tameh Shenoga B'Kodesh does not get Malchus. And Reish Lakish would have it straight across the board. Reish Lakish Amar Loka, the Gemara now analyzes the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Bechol Kodesh Lo Tiga. Okay, now we're talking about a Yoledis. And this pasuk is in Vayikra Perek Yud Beis, and a Yoledis goes through Yemei Tahara I'm sorry. You made tuma and then you made tar. This pasuk is referring to you made tahara. So for 7 days, let's say she gave birth to a boy. So for the first 7 days, she's tmeah after birth. For the next 33 days, again in the case of a zachar, then she has the status, again, this is a little bit complicated, of what's called a tvul yom. Now, a tvul yom is tameh and tar at the same time. I mean, that's an oxymoron, but her status during those 33 days is that on the one hand, she's not allowed to have any contact with Kodesh, with Hegdesh, or she's not allowed to enter into the Mikdash. But on the other hand, she's allowed to have relations with her husband. So in a sense, let's say when we get to Masechta Nida, at the end of this 7.5 year journey, we'll learn that Nida has two dimensions to it. There's an Iser Erva, an Iser Bia in the case of Nida, and also Tumas Nida. So what we're saying about the 33 days is that the Iser Nida is removed, so she's allowed to resume relations with her husband. In the case of a boy, after 7 days for the next 33 days. Even if she sees Dam, it's not considered Dam Tomei. But as far as Tumah Vitar is concerned, she still is in a state of partial Tumah, and she has the status of a Tvulim. Now, in the case of a Zohar, the night going into day 41, meaning the night after day 40, her status changes to that of a mechusar kapara. She's no longer tful yom. She went to the mikveh. She had erev shemesh. Everything was fine. But she didn't bring her karbanos until the next morning, day 41. So now we're up to the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. So the Torah says to this woman, whose status in the second stage is that of a tful yom, from day 8 to day 40, in that middle period of time, if she wants to have contact with Truma, the Torah says, B'chol Kodesh lo tiga. However, Reish Lakish understands that B'chol Kodesh lo tiga should be taken literally. And even though the Torah is referring to Truma, but since the Torah used the word Kodesh, it refers to any Kodesh. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ein Aloka. Hahu b'Truma ksiv. Right, the Torah is referring to Truma, and the Torah says that she's not allowed to have contact with Truma. Now, again, how do we know that this pasuk is referring to Truma? I'm not going to get into that. That's a little bit more complicated. But in any event, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't take the word B'chol Kodesh literally, but B'chol Kodesh is limited to Truma. If there's a lav with a chiv malchus for a tame to touch Truma, how much more so should we derive with the Kal V'chomer Hegdesh? Because as I said before, Kodesh is more Chomer than Truma in many, many different ways. The answer is Ein Onshe Min Adin. So that's the sugya of Masechta Makis. And the Gemara derives the conclusion that even if you can logically, like let's say, for example, the Torah prohibits having relations with a half a sister. You know, you share one parent with this woman. She's your half sister. The Torah doesn't say anything about having a relationship with both with a full-fledged sister. So the Gemara says, Einon Shemin Adin. Even though there's a Kal V'chomer, I mean, if a half sister is an Erva, how much more so is a full sister is an Erva? So Rabbi Yochanan is going to apply that principle of Einon Shemin Adin to the case of Tomei Shenoga B'Kodesh. So now the Gemara has another kasha here. This kasha is a little bit on the side. And what the Gemara is going to try to prove that another statement of Reish Lakish indicates that he uses this pasuk b'chol kodesh lo tiga for something else. He derives a different conclusion from this pasuk, and therefore the Gemara raised the objection: how can he use this pasuk to derive the Iser Malchus of a Tomei Shenoga B'Hegdesh when he needs the pasuk Reish Lakish Hai Kroloch Yikdosa Hai Voilei Lazar Liochel B'Fsak Kodesh? What happens if a Tomei eats Basar Kodesh? Meaning, let's say, in the case of a Shlomim, or even in the case of a Chatos, in any case whatsoever, it's Basar Kodesh, and there's a separate Iser in the Torah for a Tomei to eat it. And Reish Lakish derives that from this very same pasuk. We're going to have to show, that's the next part of the sugya, that you could derive two conclusions from the same pasuk. Number one, Tomei she'achal kodesh, and number two, Tomei she'noga b'kodesh. Now, again, the paradox here is when the Torah says b'chol kodesh lo tiga, how does Reish Lakish derive from lo tiga, lo tochal? I mean, the Torah doesn't speak about achila, it speaks about negia. To itmar, as hora liochel basa kodesh minayin Reish Lakish on b'chol kodesh lo tiga. And this pasuk, once again, is referring to a yoledes when she's in the second stage, from day 8 to day 40. And Reish Lakish derives from this pasuk b'chol kodesh lo tiga that a Tomei is not allowed to eat kodesh. Now, exactly how he sees in this pasuk achila, we're going to have to wait for that. In any event, Rabbi Yochanan Omar, he has a brisa from Abba Bardala, and according to this brisa, Asya tum also mibias migdosh. We're going to have a gzera shava called tumaso, and the Torah says that a Tomei whose tumaso bo is not allowed to enter into the Mikdash. Malahalan onesh vehizir, and through this gzera shava, we're going to graft the Isur, which is called an azhara, and the Malchus, the onesh, from Tomei shenichlas leMikdash, and graft it on to the case of Tomei she'achal kodesh. Malahalan onash vehizir, just like in the case of Bias Migdash, a Tomei has both an onesh and an azhara, is through this gzeir shava afkan, here too a Tomei who eats kodesh is included in onesh vehizir. He's got the onesh and the azhara. So whereas Reish Lakish derives the lav of Tomei she'achal kodesh from b'chol kodesh lo yiga, lo tiga, I should say, because it's a female. Rabbi Yochanan derives the Iser of Tomei she'achal kodesh from the gzeir shava tumas. But again, we're back to square one, because Reish Lakish had used this pasuk of bechol kodesh lo tiga for the Iser lav and the chiv malchus of Tomei she'noga b'kodesh. Now we see that Reish Lakish used this pasuk as referring to Tomei she'achal kodesh. So the Gemara answers the following: Tomei shenoga b'kodesh mida afka rachmana b'loshen negia, as harali ochel mida iskash kodesh lemigdash. The Gemara is arguing that Reish Lakish could derive two different prohibitions from the very same pasuk. How so? So we have a principle called the Afke Rachmana. What is the Afke Rachmana? That sometimes the Torah means X and uses a different term, which if translated literally means Y. And here, it's mina Afke Rachmana b'lashon negia. So you want to know, how does Reish Lakish understand and derive the conclusion that Tomei Shenoga B'Kodesh is Chayev Malchus? The answer is because the Torah says it that way. As I state, the pasuk says, Afke Rachmana b'lashon negia. The Torah says, B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga. Now you can ask me, okay, so if that pasuk is referring to Tomei Shenoga B'Kodesh, so how does Reish Lakish derive from this very same pasuk Tomei Sha'achal Kodesh? And the answer is Mina Iskash Kodesh LeMigdash. Now we go back to Rabbi Yochanan's logic that the Torah equates the case here in this lav to the case of a Tomei that enters into the Migdash. Now, here's the key of keys. In the case of a Tomei Shenichnas Bias Migdash, the Torah says he's Chayiv Kares. But we never find a Chayiv Kares for Tomei Shenaga B'Kodesh, and therefore, ipso facto, we must derive the conclusion that this equation of Iskash Kodesh LeMigdash is referring to Ochal Kodesh, not Naga B'Kodesh. So basically, we've accomplished our goal. Reish Lakish could derive two things from the same pasuk. From the simple pshat of the pasuk, he derives a lav without kares of Tomei Shenaga B'Kodesh, and that we derive from the case of Yoledes. But as far as Tomei She'achal B'Kodesh, we derive from the fact that this pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga generates a chiyuv kares, and that's based on the Iskash Kodesh LeMigdash. And once from Migdash we derive that the Isur Bias Migdash of Tomei is Machayev Kares, then we must be talking about a case of Kodesh, which is Machayev Kares. But Kodesh is not Machayev Kares in the case of the Gia, it's only Machayev Kares in the case of Achil. There's a lot of brisket Torah here on this, but that's way beyond our. Tanya Kavosli to Reish Lakish will bring a raya to Reish Lakish because the Torah says B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga, and this brisa is darshaning the pasuk B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga as Hara Liochel. Exactly what Reish Lakish said is written explicitly in this brisa, that this pasuk is enjoining a tummy from eating Kodesh. So you'll argue that the pasuk says Lo Tiga, it doesn't say Lo Tochal, so how can you derive an azhara to achila from the pasuk that's referring to Negia? Right, we have this hekesh between Kodesh and Migdash. Makish Kodesh LeMigdash. Ma Migdash davar sheyesh bo the Tilas Neshama, which means Kares, and now we're on Daf Lamed Daled, is Af Kodesh davar sheyesh bo Netilas Neshama. V'vinogeh Netilas Neshama v'ika el b'achila. So this is the entire logic of Reish Lakish, that the Hekesh between Kodesh and Migdash teaches you that just like in Migdash is Kares, so too in Kodesh is Kares, but there is no such thing as Kodesh in Negia that generates a Chiyuv Kares, and therefore the pasuk ipso facto must be teaching me an azhara for Ochel. Tomei Sha'ochal Kodesh, and for that he's Chayiv Kares, just like a Tomei who enters into the Migdash. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop for today, and wish you a good beginning. Parshas Bereishis. I got Chosin Torah this year. I'm not a big fan of getting Chosin Torah. I'd rather get Chosin Bereishis. I want to start something. I don't know. I can't say I finished it. Okay, then, have a great Shabbos. Thank you so much.